Hello and welcome to Stop Mething Around, a family affair, the latest effort by the Moose Jaw Crystal Meth Drug Strategy Committee to provide families who are dealing with crystal meth addiction education, support, and hope. I'm Craig Hemingway and I'm your host and joined by members of the Drug Strategy Committee, which is comprised of multiple people from across many different agencies. And those people joining us include Constable Sean Moll of the Moose Jaw Police Service, a member for 16 years and a member of the Moose Jaw Police and Crisis Team. We also have Mary Lee Booth, who is the Prevention and Awareness Campaign Coordinator for the Moose Jaw Crystal Meth Strategy Committee, and Tracy Jasper, whose family has been dealing with addiction through the daughter Megan for several years, and thank you all for joining us. We're going to start with you, Mary Lee, and when did crystal meth get on your radar to such a point that you felt it important to get this committee going in 2019?
Right. Well, prior to that, actually, I sat at a table with other leaders in the human service organizations, and we all noticed in our own organizations that the crystal meth issue was growing in Moose Jaw. So I worked in healthcare, and we noticed at that time that there were more incidents of people that were affected by crystal meth coming in the emergency department, as well as the inpatient mental health unit. Police services at the same time were noticing an increase in crystal meth incidents. As a matter of fact, since 2016, simple possession charges have risen by, or have increased by 2,000%. Possession for the purpose of trafficking charges has risen to 2,800% since 2016. So a number of agencies said it's time to do an interagency, multi-agency approach to addressing this issue in Moose Jaw.
Certainly, and Sean, to you, hearing that from Mary Lee, no secret as to why the Moose Jaw Police Service would want to get involved and tackle this problem. Again, you've been a member of the police service for 16 years. At what point in your career did you really start to see crystal meth become such a big issue?
Yeah, for sure, I'd say in the last few years. Probably, or even more 5, but it's definitely increased to the point where we're seeing people daily under the influence of crystal meth, and or people are being caught in possession of it. So it's increased a lot in the last 5 years for sure.
And why do you think that is? Because I mean, the drug itself has been around for a number of years.
Well, it's just easy access. It's cheap. It's available. And yeah, I guess the cheap side of things, you get very little and it keeps you high for a long period of time. So yeah, it's compared to the other drugs on the street or cocaine and other ones that are so expensive, this has been the go-to drug again because it's just inexpensive.
And Tracy, your journey, it's been, what, about 19 years or so since this began with Megan? 15? Okay, my apologies on the timeline, but certainly you've been dealing with your daughter Megan, who started at a young age, not with crystal meth first necessarily, but tell us about that first time you became aware of drug use from your daughter.
Well, I would say now I know more about when she used, but back then you didn't, right? You didn't think it was drugs. You thought it was she's trying to fit in high school and stuff. But when I realized, I guess when she got her first charge of drugs, ecstasy pills she was caught with, she was underage. And then that's when it oh my God, this is drugs. She's on drugs, And that's when we started seeking out services and stuff.
Do you remember that first conversation with her and the tone of the conversation when you realized that this had happened?
Yeah, just like any parent, You talk to them, what's going on, because she was with a guy that was an adult. And of course their names are on the news, but Megan wasn't because she was a young offender back then. And so it's embarrassing, and yeah, you talk to her and you say what drugs, it's illegal, you want to go to jail, like any parent would say, yeah.
All those natural things.
Yeah.
But then I guess at some point you realized that message didn't get through, right?
It didn't get through, no, because it just kept skyrocketing. And yeah, her whole attitude towards us, she was very violent towards me, very abusive. We couldn't control her. And that's when we started seeking out services with mental health and social services. And
there's a lot of misconceptions around drug use and who it happens to. And one of the misconceptions is that, well, it happens to maybe people who have a history of drug use in their family, or maybe a broken home, or maybe their economic issues are an issue in the family, and that's just a place they turn. And another misconception is that keep your kids busy and keep them active in doing things in sports and other extracurricular activities, and your chances are way down. But I mean, in both those cases, that wasn't the case with Megan, was it?
No, it wasn't, because we did keep her busy. We were a middle-class family. My husband and I both worked. We did the, Christmases, Thanksgivings, Easters to both grandparents, just like normal families do, right? We did all those, the values and everything. We had no previous addiction in our family. My husband and I have been together for 33 years, 34 actually. And yeah, like no abuse, no addictions, no nothing in our family. So not once did it cross my mind that I didn't even know really what drugs were. I never experienced it growing up, never was around it growing up.
If I could add, just from the police perspective, Craig, just because you touched on it, because this drug does not discriminate, right? Like we see it from a police side, where we see it going, where homeless people are using crystal meth, all the way up to our professionals. There's professionals that are using crystal meth, so it's across the board, and as police we see that. So yeah. Middle class, upper class, and lower class. So
it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't matter.
Keeping them involved, yeah, she was involved. She tried out for the soccer team. She was grade 9. She made the soccer team. She loves soccer, and now I know that's where she first got a drug, was from the soccer team.
Mary Lee, I guess what have you found in all your research into this, how that relates to this?
Yeah, I just want to say what Sean said about crystal meth being, it doesn't discriminate. That's so true. This drug is so addictive, and what we don't know is why people take it in the first place. And what I learned from somebody who's a person that is currently in a drug treatment court program, she said, the thing that parents need to know and to talk to their kids about is when kids are going to be trying alcohol, to use it with people they know and trust. Because she said, my first time I tried crystal meth, I was really drunk, so she was using alcohol, and there were people that she didn't know who offered her crystal meth. She said, I felt very vulnerable. I wouldn't have otherwise, but I was, didn't know these people. And then I tried it. And crystal meth is like, in our former video, like an icy hand that grabs you. And for some people, addiction happens at the first try.
Tracy, has Megan ever said why she started crystal meth?
It's funny you asked that question, because I asked her last night, why did you ever get into drugs? Because she was smart. She and she said, I don't know, it was just fit in, try it. See the rush, She said back then, she said, I thought being bad was cool. So, it's all about fitting in. It's all about, you hear you got a grade 9 going in a high school with up to grade 12, and you want to fit in. You don't want to be the geek, or you don't want to be the, nerd, or whatever it is, right? That was her thinking. And Megan was always more mature than her age, so, she always seemed to need that rush, or that, even in grade school, like, she would have to write a story about something, and she would never just say the girl by the tree. It was the girl with the red hat by the tree with the brown leaves, or, she was very detailed and very wanting more all the time.
Sean, we do hear a fair bit about, the drug use in Moose Jaw, and when there are issues and arrests and those sorts of things. Day to day, I don't think many of us see a drug world in Moose Jaw.
From the police, we do see it on the street, but I think people are calling more often as well, because our community is seeing it more on the street as well, seeing crystal meth and seeing people that are displaying bizarre behavior in our downtown core, and therefore more calls are being placed to the police. And I think also with social media, we're seeing a lot more on that aspect as well in regards to reporting it to police. So I think there is obviously drugs being used behind closed doors, but I feel like people are venturing out now more so. In my time, I've seen in the last 5 years more so out when they're under the influence of these drugs and kind of committing crimes in the daylight even.
Yeah, no, and that's a great answer. And that's why I asked is, to see if there were those examples day to day where, and maybe that also has changed as it might not have been as a parent 5 years ago or so.
Right, yeah, I think so, for sure.
Mary Lee, what's your experience and again in your research of this drug and those types of uses?
Yeah, well, we know that more people are admitting to use of crystal meth, that up to 50% of people who are currently accessing detox or treatment programs will profess to having taken crystal meth. So it is around, and it is being made in people's homes, apartments. Even I understand they can make it out of a trunk of a car now. So it's very available.
Tracy, you did reference supports that you tried to access in the early stages of Megan's use. Can you describe what those were?
Yeah, the first was mental health. We thought maybe there's something going on there before we knew, well, and after we knew, I guess. Like, we knew something was going on, right? Because she was just out of control, breaking our basement window and taking off. And, when you put rules down and you're grounded and this, and she busted the window downstairs and took off, So we kind of convinced her, we thought, we'll start with mental health. Maybe there's some issues there, maybe some problems, that she's having. So we convinced her to go, and she did go. And to me, it was like a big relief, like, oh, good, we're going to finally find out what's going on here. And when I talked to the mental health worker, and I said, so what's the problem? She said, we can't tell you. And I said, what? You can't tell me? And she said, she's 14 years old. We can't tell you that. That's confidential. So it was like a brick wall we hit again, besides the school and whatever, eh? And I went to an agency, and I said, we're having trouble with this, we need her out of the house. We have a younger daughter. She's out of control. She's violent to me. Like, I wouldn't even want my husband to go play hockey at night because she was so abusive to me. And she took it out on me because my husband, I think, because they're tougher, right? I don't know. But they always say they take it out on the ones they love the most, right? But yeah, she was very abusive to me, and one time pulled a knife on me. And so I went to this agency and told them, and I said, you got to help me, and they said, we can't help you. You're a good parent. And you don't drink, there's no alcohol, there's no abuse, there's no nothing, right? And I said, do you want me to tell you I'm going to kill her? Because I will kill her if you don't help me. And they laughed at me and said, you won't do it. So it was like brick wall after brick wall.
And not a reference to say, oh, we can help you, but these people can, nothing like that?
No, I don't think the help was there. Who could have helped me back then? It's almost like she had to commit crimes and go to jail for her to be removed from our home. And isn't that sad back then? Now there's more supports, more help. Now you can go to the police and, not just take my kid, they don't come and just arrest. They talk to you, they guide you. But yeah, back then, 15 years ago, the awareness wasn't there either, right? Marijuana was the big drug. Now it's legal today,
Sean, is there a different approach for, again, that the police have taken that's probably changed over the last 10, 15 years and how you handle whether it's crystal meth or even another drug addiction situation?
Right, and that's where our police and crisis team comes in. So we started approximately 3 years ago, and that's where there's a police officer teamed up with a mental health professional who's with health. So we now try to attend to those calls anytime there's a mental health piece or there's an addictions piece. And then we have the police and a social worker with us and actively listen to our people that have, these enormous things going on with drug use and poverty and all these different things. And we try to find one thing to kind of focus on and access the services in the community. So yeah, and that's what's great. That's kind of the new way of looking at the addiction piece, is to have a social worker and a police officer work together, have the police information, have the health information, and try direct our people the most direct route to access help quickly and more easily, right? Because it's very complicated, or can be very complicated. So
I wish that was there back then. I really do. Yeah.
We've started to scratch the surface on hearing Tracy's story about Megan, and it gets a bit darker before it gets better. And this is Stop Mething Around, a family affair. When we come back, we're going to talk more about crisis situations and not only Tracy's story, but also what the police have witnessed, and then start to tell you about some of the ways in which there is help, there is support, and there is hope. And welcome back to Stop Mething Around, a family affair. I'm Craig Hemingway. The story is good now for Tracy Jasper's daughter Megan, but went through some pretty dark times. We've already alluded to the beginning of her drug use and some of the issues, and already an arrest. But as that progressed, it really got a lot worse before it was able to get better. And how much can you share about that experience with Megan and what Megan went through? And she has told this story, of course, in the previous Stop Mething Around video. She's done a lot of speaking on this herself. But from your perspective, can you tell us that story and how of the crisis your family dealt with?
Yeah, I will. And going back to her story of Stop Mething Around, there's lots of things I learned in her story too that I didn't know. So I encourage you to watch it. But whatever. So we went to the one arrest. Where do I start? It's so long. But there was more than one arrest. There was another arrest where she was caught with drugs. Actually, it started with my husband and I were out, and we came home one night, and there's a cop car sitting outside our house, and it's like, what the heck, And I knew my other daughter was with Megan and her boyfriend, and so we went, and Rick says, well, I'm going to go and check why he's here. And they were waiting for us to get home to search our house. It's like, what? So yeah, they almost never let him come back in the house, my husband. But as soon as the rest of the police showed up, they came and searched our house, and that's the most embarrassing. You feel so invaded. I mean, there's a dog in my house. I don't allow dogs in my house, the search dog, everything, upstairs, downstairs. And they were searching and taking stuff out of the basement, and because Megan basically lived downstairs. And I remember when it was all done and the police left, and they had arrested both my daughters. My youngest daughter was arrested with my oldest daughter because she was in the car, so of course they take everybody in the car. And I remember saying to the police officer, did you find drugs? And he said, yes, we did. And it's like, oh my God, like, how embarrassing, Anyway, but the next day when I went down, and they let my youngest daughter out that night because she was just an innocent victim caught in a bad place, right? And we went down the next day to get her cell phone and stuff, and there was a constable there that we knew, and I said, so what kind of drugs did you find? And he said, we didn't find drugs. I said, what? I was told you found drugs. He said, no, there was no drugs. But I think Megan was to the point in Yorkton that they just wanted her for anything, right? But she would never get long in jail, right? Just, this or probation and all that. But what it really hit is on the news, when it was on the news, and that arrest, because now she's an adult, they mention your name. And it was very, very embarrassing. My husband didn't go to work for a few days. It was just so embarrassing. And then I remember my brother phoning me, and he said about Megan. I said, how do you know? And because I live in Yorkton there, Regina area. And he says, well, my uncle had seen it in the Leader Post, and, had told my mom and dad, and my brother heard about it. And I said, oh my God, like you're just so humiliated. You feel like such a failure as a parent. And he said, Tracy, he said it could be worse. I said, what could get worse? Like, this has gone too far already. Like, he said, nobody's dying of cancer. We'll get through this, And that really meant so much to me, like at that time, because he said, that's the support you need, Nobody judged you. Family didn't anyway. Maybe there was people out there that judged us, but whatever. They weren't our close friends. And even close friends says, called us, come over, you guys. Our son was the same thing. We can relate. So that was a big a big part of Megan's drug use, I guess you could call it, or rough time, is to get through that. But yeah, it was arrests, it was lawyers, it was, you know, and then she worked, and she worked at a retirement home, and she always went to work. She was a good worker. On her own time, she would, you know, the riders were playing, and she'd go in on her days off and have a rider, like on a Sunday. And so you think, oh, this is getting better. She's, you know, out of that stage, and, you know, and then all of a sudden something would happen again, you know, or you could actually at least talk to her. So, but from what I know today, from what she told me, she never was out of the drug. You know, she's manipulating, you know, I don't know what drugs back then they were. Yeah. Was it marijuana?
And isn't that a hallmark? I guess, you know, one of the terms would be a high-functioning addict. You know, and Mary Lee, it's probably something you've heard and again and seen in your research is, you know, people they can get by function. For a point, right?
Right. And what we know about crystal meth is that it does make people feel like they're really functioning very well, because it gives them this feeling of well-being, and they can stay up and they can be really productive. The thing with crystal meth is that the body is not made to be staying up 3 days in a row or 4 days in a row. So there is a point where they crash. And so one thing that family members will want to know is that if somebody is at a point where they are crashing, and what they need at that point is they need to be hydrated, they need to be fed, and they need time to sleep. And so that isn't the time to kind of get into, you know, you need to go to a detox or you need to go to a treatment. So families, it's helpful for them to know this, is that when the body crashes, they need to be hydrated, fed, and sleep. And then when the person is able to, when they are not intoxicated, they can have a conversation about, you know, we really care about you, what can we do to help you, you know, get on a better road. The thing with crystal meth also, though, is that the person themselves has to be at a point of knowing that they have to change. And so sometimes that happens when there is a legal crisis or a health crisis. And sometimes during those times are opportunities to look down the road of recovery. And Sean can tell a little bit more about what happens when there's a legal crisis. If somebody is, let's say, arrested or caught with crystal meth.
Yeah, if we get called to a person that's in crisis, our team would go and speak with that person, and they're really in crisis. They're at the lowest point right now, and this is a time where you're going to hopefully catch them and they want to make a change. So that's when we're going to insert things like counseling, or we're going to insert things like ask them about counseling, or ask them if they want to do detox. And you're hoping that they're going to bite on that when they're in that crisis, because things aren't good right now. You don't like the way things are going right now, arguing with family, whatever that looks like, have no money. So yeah, that's where our team likes to, yeah, of course, catch them when they're upset and try to offer them, you know, some support.
And when you're dealing with situations where there are parents or guardians involved, that has to add another layer of difficulty, because you're dealing with frustration and anger, sure, disbelief, and all of those emotions, right?
Yeah, no, and I know our team, like, there's often times where our team will go into a crisis situation and we'll be talking with, you know, our person who's, you know, struggling with crystal meth, boy, girl, teenager, adult, whoever that might be. But then in addition to helping and supporting her and trying to get her in the right direction, we find that shortly after meeting with her, we need to talk to the family now and say, look, how are you guys doing? Obviously this is affecting you. And then that's where our team, our mental health professionals, and will insert themselves as well with the family and offer supports in the community for them as well, and find out where their heads are at. So.
Addiction is a family disorder. So what we do know is that addiction also, it's a medical disorder that is treatable. But when one person is addicted, it affects the whole family. You know, psychologically, physically, emotionally, mentally, and also sometimes financially. And so we do say to people, and I think this is the hardest thing, especially if you're a parent, it's that balance between, you know, I love this person, I need to support them, I can't see them go through this difficult route, to the point of if I keep doing things for them and giving them money, is this keeping them from the normal progression of recovery? So am I kind of getting in the way of their recovery? Because sometimes people just need to experience the natural consequence of things in order to reach a point where they're ready to address their addiction.
And it sounds like, you know, Tracy, with your story, that you ran that whole gamut of enabling actions, because those are your first instincts, are to do the things Mary Lee mentioned, because you want to help in all those ways. It sounds like at some point that you know, you stopped, and then that helped.
Exactly what Mary Lee said. It is emotionally, it's financial. I remember things were just getting back again, you know, normal, and then it would start again, you know. And I remember she got arrested again and need a lawyer and all this, and you know, and you know, you love your child so much that you want to help them. And I knew Megan was raised with values, and I knew deep down in there was my Megan.
No, and you know, and it's it was a long journey, and she's been on the road to recovery for, you know, over 4 years now, but. So I kind of can't believe you're able to talk about it this well, only because probably there's been that amount of time to pass.
Yeah, I still get
brings you to this point, right?
Yeah, it does, because it's emotion. It's happy now, right?
Right, but it was, as you said, you know, a 15-year journey from the start to the end, and the things you've gone through, and so the enabling piece, you know, again, you've discussed. Yeah, we provided money and these things, which we thought was a solution, but maybe only short term, and then it just became more and more. At what point? Were you at the point where you said we can't do this, and how difficult the decision was it to make?
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about when I did, and then I'll tell you when I didn't. Yeah, like she took off. Like, I mean, she was done school. She took off, and you know, she text, you know, can I borrow $40? You know, not too often would I get a phone call. And please, Mom, please, you know, and it's like, okay, does she have a gun to her head? Does she need? Like, remember, I don't know anything about drugs right back then. Does she go for a drug deal? Are they gonna, you know? So you'd send the $40 or the $50, or I'm starving, I'm living on the streets, I haven't ate, you know, can I get $20, you know? So I guess it's enabling, right? You can send money. And Megan tells me to this day now that she says, and you think if they were holding a gun to my head, they'd let me use my phone? But as a parent, you're not thinking, you just, you know, protect, right? I remember one time my whole paycheck went to a down payment for a lawyer, just to get a lawyer, you know, and stuff. And then, you know, then she went on the run. And the second last time she was arrested, she had talked to my sister, and my sister really thought Megan was going to change, because every time Megan, we'd pay for a lawyer or put it, you know, I'm going to change, I'm going to get a job, I'm done with this life, blah, you know, that's the manipulating, right? I see that now. She convinced me back then. She convinced my sister put out money, you know, for her. And so yeah, and then she went on the run. She was supposed to live at my sister's, and she went on the run, and my sister just was beside herself. My sister has no kids. Megan was always her girl. They were very, very close relationship. And she just couldn't believe it. She'd phone me crying, and I said, Roxy, you got to turn the page. You got to move on. I've had to. You know, this is the last time. And I didn't want to put the last money down for that lawyer when she ran. But it was my sister and my husband kind of convinced me, you know, she really means it this time, you know. It's just the manipulating. And when she went on the run, and I remember she phoning me. I was in Regina, and she said, can I come home? And I haven't heard from her for a long time. You'd hear sometimes weeks on end, you wouldn't hear from her, or the text about $40 or something. And I remember my sister saying, we're tracking, like we're on Facebook if something happens. Like if she goes missing, we know where to start, or where she was lost, kind of, which city, Edmonton, or, you know. But that's what you go through, the emotions, the stress, you know, to me, I kind of flipped the page and that's it. She's either cleans up her life. I guess maybe I was tougher, just had it, I don't know. But I remember her phoning me, and I was at Costco in Regina. I had just stopped there before my way home, and she said, hi, Mom, what are you doing? And I said, I'm in Regina. And she said, can I come home? And it was just like this little girl's voice, you know, not the 28-year-old voice. It was this little girl's voice, you know, can I come home? And I said, of course, you can always come home. And I said, I'm at Costco, meet me at Costco, I'll be done in a half an hour. So I was done and didn't see her, and then all of a sudden, I was about to call or text her and said, where are you? And she said, I'm right here, where are you parked? So I told her, and she came, and it's like, I looked, and it's like, that was not my daughter. She had long, dark hair, my daughter. When I first looked at her, she had blonde, dried out, long hair. Like she had beautiful, long, natural curly hair. It was blonde, it was dried out. She was skinny like I've never seen skinny, like just like a rail. You know, in this little sundress, it was summer, it was hot, and I just like, oh my God, you know? So she got in the car, and the mother I am, like, what's going on? Like, where are you? What are you doing? Like, you know, you know, I'm tired. And I guess that's what you say about crashing, right? And we were leaving, and every bump I hit over a railway track or something, she fell asleep right away, right? And I thought, okay, let her sleep. And then every bump we'd hit, she'd like this. And it's like, what is going on? But now I understand when you're in that life, you're always on edge, whether with gangs, with drug dealers, right? You're always on the lookout for that stuff. And she came home that weekend, and it was July, just before July long weekend. And she kind of was in the basement. She wouldn't talk. I said, you turn yourself in, or I will, and I will phone the police. And I wanted her to do it on her own.
So at that point, she was outstanding charges, that sort of thing?
Yeah, she was on the run, and I knew that, and I should have maybe phoned. I don't know. Like, as a parent, you have, you know, and I thought, okay, I'll give her to this day, and if she doesn't phone, I'm phoning, you know? And then the police are going to come, and they're going to come into my house, and they're going to arrest her, and then, you know, and then she's going to go to jail, and that's what she needs, you know? And so I said, you got a couple more days, you know? And then there was people showing up, like not so good people outside my, you know, on the street. And I just said, get out. I don't want those people around here. Just get out of my house now. And I just kicked her out. You know, I didn't wait. I didn't even think of phoning police, nothing. I just, get out. I kicked her out of my house. Because I gave her a couple days to turn her life around and start by turning yourself in, right? And I know our grandson, we raised our grandson, and she was all about, you know, Austin. And she didn't even pay much attention to him, and that's her boy, you know, she was just, and she really didn't pay a lot of attention. So, you know, that's not the Megan you know, that's not my daughter. That's the drugs, right? And that's one thing that's really hard as a parent to accept is when they're this violent, they looks, you know, the looks of them, that's not the daughter you raised. That's the daughter that's on drugs. That's what drugs do to you. You lose all family values, you lose everything. And you gotta keep convincing yourself, that's not the daughter you raised, you know, it's the drugs, right? And it really is, especially crystal meth.
Yeah, well, it thankfully did turn out better for the Jaspers, and we'll have more on that, and supports that would be available for you, and how much that has come along in the last number of years, and the availability and the variety of supports that are available now compared to a number of years ago, and more on that when Stop Mething Around, a Family Affair continues. And thanks for joining us for Stop Mething Around, a Family Affair. I'm Craig Hemingway, and when we took a break, we were hearing from Tracy Jasper, who had, at that point in July 2017, had just told her daughter Megan to get out of the house, and that was enough. So I want you to pick up that story just a few months later, which is really Megan's redemption story.
Yeah. So yeah, I kicked her out, and every night I prayed to God to keep her safe, to keep her alive. because I knew the life she was leading, that she would end up dead. Knew one day I'd get a phone call that she'd be dead or in jail. This is where it's heading. It was getting worse and worse. But I had to live with that. I had to think of us. I had to think of my grandson that lived with us, right? And I gave her the opportunity to clean up. So yeah, every night I prayed to keep her safe, to keep her alive. And you would hear from her here and there, you know, again, $20, $40, this, that, you know. And again, you think, oh, she's got a gun to her head, she's drugged, you know. So you'd give $20, this, that. And then I remember being at work, and it was September 7th, and I got this phone call, funny, 939, whatever number. So I stepped out of work and took this phone call. And it was Saskatchewan police. And she said, it was a lady, and she said, you know, is this Tracy? And yeah, and she said, I just want to let you know we arrested your daughter. And I said, oh, thank God. Like, the pressure, the relief, it was just like tons of bricks left me. And it was quiet, and she said, pardon me. I said, she's safe. I said, I've been praying since July 1st, you know, to keep her safe. And then she just went right into, you know, and she's arrested and this and that, you know. And it was just like a relief, and the wall came up with me then. She's safe, nobody's gonna hurt her. She's in jail, whatever happens, happens, right? So, and she phoned me, you know, from Pine Grove or White Birch, whatever those facilities were. And you gotta get me a lawyer. Mom, you gotta get me, I'm done with you and your lawyers. I'm done. So, you know, and it was almost, and then she, you know, and she'd hang up on me, and I thought, fine, I didn't care. She was safe, and you're gonna pay now. I don't care if you go to jail for 2 years, 5 years, you're safe. Nobody, you know, I was just done. And yeah, no, you gotta get me a lawyer, she'd phone. And then I wouldn't answer phone calls anymore, because it was a nice phone, because it was always the demand. Gotta get me a lawyer, gotta get me a lawyer, gotta get a good lawyer. I'm looking at the pen. That's all right. To me, that wall was up, you know, but the relief of her being safe was there, you know. So she started phoning my sister, and my sister took her calls. She ended up, and she remembered Megan calling me one time about this drug court, you know, and she was more civil talking to me because she knew I was done. And talking about, I might get this drug court. And to me, I didn't know any of this. Oh, that's good, like, you know, what's that? And she'd tell me a little, but she didn't really know. I didn't know. All I knew is she needs to go somewhere locked up till she cleans up. That was my concern. So yeah, October 31st, Halloween, she ended up getting drug court and had to live at Kate's place in Regina and attend drug court. And my sister, she was a big part of her recovery, because I kind of shut the door a little bit, you know. And my sister was right there and opened that door, and she was there. And Halloween night, my sister went down to Kate's place and, you know, went to see her, and she took her, you know, hygiene products, because they're there with just the clothes, the jail clothes on. That's it. No shampoo, no soap, no nothing, you know. So my sister was a big support in recovery. Plus, my sister lived in Regina. We live in Yorkton, you know. And I remember Megan said, you got to come, Mom, I got drug court. Can you come? I want to see Austin. You know, it's Halloween night. I want to see, you know. And I thought, no, I'm not driving 2 hours during the week. Austin's going Halloween in here. Like, I didn't drop things anymore. You know, I was done.
And isn't that, you know, something, because we alluded to it before about, you know, as a parent trying to deal with this, and you're dealing with the embarrassment, at some point you also have to be able to live your life.
Right.
You know, and reclaim some of your life, to otherwise the addiction is harming you as much as it's harming
And
her.
I think I came to that point July 1st when I kicked her out.
Yeah.
It was like, I knew I'd get that phone call, but I had to turn the page and move on and live life.
Yeah.
Right? I've been living this hell for how many years?
And so it kept, you know, getting better. The drug court and that process really did lead her to such a great place where she is today.
Kate's Place, Drug Court, Pine Lodge, that was all part of her recovery, and she wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for those things, where you had to go to Drug Court. You know, she went to Pine Lodge, she came out of that Pine Lodge a different person. She was always this Megan high power, you know, kind of her way, very, you know. She came out of Pine Lodge, she has taught me, she's taught my sister. She always sees the good in people. I guess there they break you down and they get all the feelings on the table, and you know, you're not the big shot now, you're not the high power, you know. And I think we need more Pine Lodges, I think we need more drug courts, I think we need more safe housing like Kate's Place, you know, affordable safe housing. Because look, she is so successful today because of those things. If she would have went to jail for 2 years or 3 years or whatever, 6 months, she wouldn't be where she is today. Because to me, jail is just a school, you know? You go there, you serve your time, get out. Where you go? Back to the life you only know, right? Whereas the drug court helps you, and you know, the addiction, you're not, there's no drugs, right? You got curfews, you got stuff. And she graduated with from drug court. She never had one curfew breach or whatever there, like she was always there on time. She went to Sask Polytech, she's got her business certificate. She's working with the John Howard today, like helping clients, and she started a few meetings here in Moose Jaw, running meetings, you know, I don't even know, every night there's a meeting that, you know, but that's all part of her recovery. We had just had her 4-year birthday on September 7th, and she's 4 years clean, and she tells me she has to work at it, and she'll be working on this recovery for the rest of her life. Because that's what crystal meth does. It gets a hold of you, and it doesn't leave you.
And of course, she's been telling her story.
Yes.
Thanks in part to the Moose Jaw Crystal Meth Drug Strategy Committee and Marilee Booth as the development coordinator. I mean, when you first heard this story, I mean, what kind of hope did that give you that this would be able to help propel your committee and help provide that education and support to others that are struggling?
Yeah, Megan is a gift to our community, and I was so happy that she's so willing to share her story, because it is a story of hope. It's a story of recovery. I think the thing that we really want, because I want to follow up on some things that Tracy had said in her story. She talked about you know, feelings of embarrassment and humiliation. When family members have a person who is affected by crystal meth, you're going to feel those and other kinds of feelings, lots of sadness, grief, and those are normal feelings given the situation. So we really want them honor it, but talk about it with somebody. Get some informal support, like through friends, maybe some support groups locally, but also look at maybe there's some formal supports, like through counseling supports, or you know, a treatment family education group that we'll talk about shortly, that's offered here at Mental Health and Addictions, because you can't go through this alone. If you're feeling really isolated, it will really affect your mental health. So people need to continue what Tracy was saying, you know, doing family get-togethers. Sometimes your loved one may not be there and you'll be really missing them, but you need to continue as best as you can, birthday celebrations and that sort of thing.
So Sean, I was going to ask you then too, you know, from your perspective, when you're dealing with those that are dealing with the crystal meth addiction or other addictions, and they are a minor and you're dealing with the parents, what are some of the things you can tell parents, and maybe that are even to get ahead of it? What are early signs and things they can and should be doing day to day to watch for, you know, drug behavior?
Sure, yeah, suppers and conversations with your children for sure, but also your house is your palace, right? And so for our younger folks, right, the children, you know, we hear this from parents sometimes where they say their daughter's got a lock on their door in the basement and they don't go inside. That's completely opposite of what I would tell parents that I've spoken to, is go into your daughter's room, go into your son's room often. See what they've got in there, see what they're doing in there, right? And that just keeps the conversation open. They might be angry with you initially, but then eventually they're going to accept it and it's going to be part of the normal thing, right? So But yeah, advice to parents, definitely search bedrooms, check their bedrooms, have lots of conversations with your kids about drugs, obviously. And then I guess we could touch quickly on the Youth Detox Act, right? As parents, you may feel like your hands are tied sometimes, but if you do have a son or daughter that's kind of falling off the rails and is getting into the drugs and the alcohol and maybe not going to school and not getting out of bed, you can, as a parent, go to the court and apply for a youth detox warrant. And essentially that's where your son or daughter, that warrant would come to the police, and the police would go pick up your son or daughter, and then they would be put into a facility for up to 15 days, and it's a detox period if they're starting to go down that route. So there are options for parents, for sure.
Is there
I don't know if there's anything to add to that? But.
Yeah, I was going to say, is there a top 3, top 5 list of what to do? So I've had the talk with my kids, and that hasn't solved anything, which the talking rarely does, right? But in terms of actions, here's who I should call. This support, I'll call them first, and then if not that, then this, and go down that list. Is there, again, a top 3 or 5?
Well, I would say in Moose Jaw, calling mental health and addiction services, 306-691-6464, ask for an intake worker, tell them their story, and hopefully they'll find a resource for you. For parents of 12 to 17-year-olds who are dangerously using, the YDDSA, Youth Drug Detox Stabilization Act, is an option. The other thing is that there is a program called the Matrix program that is offered at mental health and addiction services for people who are using stimulants, crystal meth being a stimulant substance. But there is a family education component to that program, and it's really, really important. Like, people recover, their chances of recovery are heightened if they have good supports, and it could be family, blood family, or it could be like close friends too. But if they have more supports, their recovery will be increased. So that program, the family education program, is found at Mental Health and Addiction Services. So phoning and asking intake for that is another option. I also understand that in Moose Jaw there are some works in getting a Nar-Anon support group. So that's a peer support group. I think that there's some actions trying to get that started. So that would be another resource.
And you mentioned earlier, some of the effects of crystal meth, and it can keep you wired for a few days before you end up crashing. But isn't that incredibly important too for parents, is to learn about the drug, learn about crystal meth, how it acts, what it does, and that will in turn give you that you're a little more able to provide that empathy to your children that are struggling.
You got it. Because the more you know about crystal meth and how it impacts the brain chemistry, then you will understand why it's difficult for somebody who is dependent on crystal meth to get off. And you'll understand the cravings, and you'll understand the tolerance. If you don't, it's very easy to kind of blame that person and say, well, you can just get off it. It's your choice. And it really isn't, because crystal meth really does mess the brain. And as Tracy had said, it changes your loved one into somebody that you don't recognize, because they'll do things, say things, behave in ways that they don't normally, because it has changed their brain so much.
And Sean, you've mentioned some of the advice you've got for parents, and again, you're part of the crisis team in Moose Jaw, which didn't exist, a handful of years ago, and that's become a lot of what our police is doing, and dealing with those problems with members of the health authority to try and tackle problems like crystal meth addiction and other issues. Can you speak to how that has helped you as a police officer in our community?
Yeah, speak specifically to our team. Absolutely. It's just, when you put two professional agencies together and you share information, and that information that you share is used for the betterment of the people that you talk to, that just all around works really well for our clients, right? So when somebody's in crisis and we can have police information and health information and have a better understanding of what that person is struggling with, it's easier for us to direct them the right way.
Mary Lee, any closing thoughts? Anything else you want to ensure we know about the Crystal Meth Drug Strategy Committee, and where to find help?
Well, I would encourage people watching this video to watch Stop Mething Around as well. So that's also found if you just kind of Google Stop Mething Around. That was their first video that we did. Thank you to all the people who supported this prevention and awareness project. This has been an amazing year. We've been invited to do a number of different presentations. One that we're doing right now includes Megan. She's out in the schools talking to some grade 7 to 12 classrooms around her story, which is very, very impactful. So I'm going to leave it at that because it's been an amazing year spreading the word on meth.
And Tracy Jasper, thank you for sharing your story about Megan, and you know, because we're all thrilled that it's turned out the way it has turned out with Megan being an advocate for fighting crystal meth addiction, as Mary Lee's alluded to. I guess as you hear about all these supports, and looking back on your experience when not all these were available, do you think, man, if only?
If only I had that 12 to 17-year-old there support. That's what we needed. Like I said, you've heard dead end after dead end. But I think it's so much more awareness now. You know, back then it was the stigma of it all too, right? And now it's so much more, we're aware of this and we're open, we're talking about it, right? We're doing these videos, you know, it's all over Facebook when it's, you know, Awareness Day, and, you know. And I think the talking and getting it out there so parents don't feel alone. Back then, I felt alone. I really did.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, and thanks to Sean and Mary Lee for your contributions today to Stop Mething Around, a family affair. You can visit the Moose Jaw Crystal Meth Drug Strategy Committee Facebook page and find all sorts of resources there and links to the original video that Mary Lee referenced and a number of other great articles and presentations and hope. There's lots there. Thanks for joining us.